This is HOA Justice Stories. And yes, the tow truck really showed up. I am standing on my own front walkway in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and Betty Carter is screaming at me about a curb number that has been buried under 8 inches of snow for 3 days. She is holding her phone on a gimbal rig like she is shooting a documentary, and she keeps jabbing her finger toward the curb while the wind whips snow around us. "You are in violation of Section 12-4, she shouts over the wind. "Your address must be visible at all times for emergency services." This conversation is not a debate, it is a directive. I look down at the curb. There is a snowbank taller than my knee covering the painted numbers. I cleared my driveway and the walkway this morning, but the city plow came through an hour ago and shoved half the street back onto my property line. I tell her the curb was visible yesterday before the plow came back. She does not care. She taps something on her phone screen with one gloved finger, still filming me with the other hand. "I just logged your citation," she says. "You have 48 hours to make it compliant or the fine doubles." Then she turns and walks back toward the street, her boots crunching through the snow, that little notebook she always carries already coming out of her coat pocket. I moved here 6 months ago because I got a community event coordinator job with a local nonprofit, and the rent was cheaper than anything near Detroit. I knew the Evergreen Drift Association was active. I saw the signs on every block and the rules packet in my lease folder, but I figured it would be the usual stuff about lawn height and trash cans. I was wrong. This place runs winter like a military checkpoint. Every snowfall triggers a wave of inspections, citations, and phone calls routed through a hotline that Betty Carter controls personally. She is the Fines and Enforcement Coordinator, which apparently means she patrols the neighborhood with a camera, a notebook, and a vendetta. The HOA has no actual authority to ticket anyone, but they write up violations, send invoices, and threaten liens if you do not pay. And if you push back, they escalate fast. The stakes here are not just annoying fines. My job depends on reliable schedules and decent sleep, and this HOA chaos has already cost me 2 early morning shifts, because I was up until midnight dealing with violation notices and phone calls. If I lose this job, I lose the lease, and I am back to square one in a market where affordable housing does not exist. So I need to fix this fast and clean. No drama, no lawsuits I cannot afford. I thought I could stay under the radar and ride it out until spring. That lasted about 3 weeks. The first sign of trouble was a door hanger 2 days after the first big snow, in November. It had the Evergreen Drift Association logo at the top and a checklist of violations. Someone had checked the box next to snow removal insufficient and circled a note at the bottom that said failure to maintain clear pathways within 24 hours of snowfall will result in fines starting at $75. I looked at my walkway. It was clear. I looked at my driveway. Also clear. I looked at the curb. There was a 2-inch layer of slush where the plow had gone by, but nothing I could do about that without a snowblower. I called the HOA hotline number on the hanger. A recorded message told me to leave my address and concern, and someone would follow up within 2 business days. I left a message. No one called back. 3 days later, I got an invoice in the mail for $75, dated the same day as the door hanger. No hearing, no warning, just a bill. I went to the next HOA meeting, which happened in the community center near the main entrance gate. About 20 people showed up, most of them older homeowners who looked like they had been dealing with this for years. Betty Carter sat at the front table with 2 other board members, a man in his 60s who barely spoke, and a woman in her 50s who kept nodding along with everything Betty said. Betty ran the meeting like a courtroom. She read through a list of violations from the past month, calling out addresses and fine amounts. When she got to mine, she did not even look up. Pathway obstruction, $75. Overdue as of today. I raised my hand. She ignored me. I stood up and said my name and my address. She looked at me for the first time. "You have a concern," she said in a tone that made it clear I should sit back down. I said the pathway was not obstructed. I cleared it the same day as the snow, and no one called me back when I left a message. She tilted her head slightly, and I saw that little notebook sitting on the table in front of her. She opened it, flipped a page, and said, "I have a photo from that morning showing slush accumulation at the curb line. That is a code violation. If you want to dispute it, you can file a written appeal with the management company, but the fine stands until the appeal is processed." I asked how long that takes. She said 6 to 8 weeks. I asked what happens if I just do not pay. She smiled. "We add late fees, and if it goes over 120 days, we file a lien." Then she moved on to the next address. I paid the $75 because I did not have time to fight it, and I figured it was a one-time thing. It was not. 2 weeks later, another hanger. This time the violation was guest parking in a snow emergency zone. I had 2 friends over for dinner the night before a storm, and they parked on the street in front of my unit because my driveway only fits 1 car. The hanger said all street parking is prohibited during snow emergency declarations, and the emergency had been declared at 4 p.m. the previous day. I checked my email. No alert. I checked my phone. No text. I went online and found the HOA website, which had a banner at the top that said snow emergency alerts are sent to registered members only, and registration requires a separate login that nobody told me about when I moved in. I called the hotline again. This time, someone picked up. It was Betty. I recognized her voice immediately, that flat tone that sounds patient but is really just contempt with a smile. She told me the snow emergency protocol is in the rules packet, and ignorance is not an excuse. I asked how I was supposed to know about an alert system I was never told existed. She said the information is available on the website, and if I had attended the new resident orientation in October, I would have been walked through it. I did not attend because no one sent me an invitation. She said invitations are mailed to all new residents. I never got one. She said that is a postal issue, not an HOA issue, and my guests were in violation. The fine was $150. I asked why it was double the last one. She said repeat violations carry escalating penalties. I told her this was not a repeat, it was a completely different issue. She said the system does not differentiate. Then she hung up. That was when I realized this was not random enforcement. This was targeting. Betty Carter had decided I was a problem, probably because I stood up at that meeting, and now every snowfall was an excuse to write me up. I started keeping my own records. I took photos of my walkway every morning after I cleared it. I checked the weather forecast obsessively. I made sure my guests parked in my driveway or down the block, never in front of my unit. It did not matter. The violations kept coming. One week it was snow piled too close to the mailbox cluster, which I did not even touch because the plow put it there. Another week it was ice melt residue on the sidewalk, which Betty claimed was creating a slip hazard even though the whole neighborhood looked like a salt factory. Each violation came with a fine, and each fine came with a 2-day turnaround and a threat about liens. I talked to my neighbors. Most of them just shrugged and said they pay the fines and move on, it is easier than fighting. One guy, an older man who has lived here for 15 years, told me Betty has been running the snow compliance program for 3 winters now, and every year it gets worse. He said she uses it like a personal revenue stream, writing up anyone who pushes back on other HOA issues, and then burying them in winter violations until they either pay up or move out. He said the management company does not care because the HOA is technically a client, and Betty makes sure the invoices look legitimate enough that nobody questions the process. He told me to keep my head down and wait for spring. I tried. I really did. but Betty was not interested in letting me disappear. The escalation started in early December. I got a certified letter at my door which I had to sign for, and inside was a notice that said my guests would be cited or towed during the next snow emergency if they parked anywhere on HOA property, which apparently included the street even though the street is public. I called a friend of mine, Rachel, who works as a paralegal at a small firm downtown. She looked at the letter and said the towing threat was probably unenforceable because the HOA does not own the street, but the citation part could stick if the HOA rules define guest parking limits during emergencies. She told me to pull the full rules packet and start documenting everything because if this went to a hearing or a dispute, I would need a paper trail. I went back to the HOA website and downloaded the governing documents. It was 140 pages of dense legal text, but buried in Section 9 was a clause that said the board may designate temporary parking restrictions during weather emergencies as deemed necessary for safety and access. That gave them cover to do pretty much whatever they wanted as long as they called it a safety issue. I started taking more photos. Every time I cleared snow, I documented it with timestamps. Every time the plow came through and shoved a berm onto my property, I photographed that too. I kept copies of every violation notice, every invoice, every email. Rachel told me to also document Betty's behavior, so I started noting every time I saw her on patrol with that notebook and that gimbal rig. She was out there almost every morning after a snowfall, walking the blocks with her phone recording everything. I watched her stop at other units and take close-up shots of mailboxes, curbs, walkways, driveways. She did not knock on doors or talk to anyone. She just filmed, wrote in her notebook, and moved on. It looked less like HOA enforcement and more like surveillance. The temperature was rising briefly in mid-December, and I needed to capture the melt pattern before it changed, because the city was forecasting another storm within 48 hours, and I wanted proof that the slush on my curb was temporary and weather-related, not a maintenance failure. I went out with my phone and took video of the whole street, showing that every single unit had the same slush line along the curb. I uploaded it to a cloud folder and sent Rachel the link. She said it was good evidence, but I needed something stronger if I was going to prove selective enforcement. She suggested I file a public records request with the city to get the plow schedule and route maps, so I could cross-reference the timing of violations with the actual plow passes. I did that, and 2 weeks later I got a PDF with timestamps showing the plow hit my street at 6:45 a.m. On 3 of the 4 days I had been cited for curb snow. Betty's violation notices were all logged within an hour of the plow pass, which meant she was either following the plow truck or timing her patrols to catch people right after the city dumped snow back onto their property. That felt like a setup. I also started digging into the HOA budget. The management company posts quarterly financials on the website, and I downloaded the last 2 years of reports. There was a line item under winter operations called Emergency Vendor Services, and the amounts were weird. The budget allocated $12,000 for snow removal, but the actual spending was over $22,000 in the last fiscal year. I cross-referenced the vendor invoices, which were listed by company name but not itemized. One company, Northwind Contractors, showed up 5 times between December and March with payments ranging from $1,800 to $4,500. I Googled them. No website, no reviews, no business listing, just a name. I asked Rachel if that was normal. She said it was a red flag, especially if the invoices were not itemized, because it meant the HOA could be paying for services that were never performed or billing for work that did not match the scope. She told me to keep digging. The second escalation happened right before Christmas. I was at work setting up chairs for a community craft fair when my phone started blowing up with texts from my neighbor across the street. She sent me 3 photos in a row. The first one showed Betty standing on my front walkway with 2 people I did not recognize. both wearing neon yellow reflective vests like road crew workers. The second photo showed Betty pointing at my front door while one of the vest guys took photos with a tablet. The third photo showed all three of them standing on my porch, looking through the window next to my door. I called my neighbor immediately. She said they had been there for about 10 minutes, walked around the side of my unit, checked the back patio, and then came back to the front. She said she heard Betty say something about code compliance and unscheduled inspection, but she could not hear the rest. I thanked her and hung up, then called Rachel. She said the HOA cannot enter my property without notice unless there is an emergency, and even then they need to document it. She told me to go home and check for any damage or entry, and if they had gone inside, to call the police. I left work early and drove home. My front door was still locked, no signs of forced entry, but there were boot prints in the snow on my patio and along the side of the unit where the basement window is. I checked the window. It was locked, but there were smudge marks on the glass like someone had tried to look inside. I took photos of everything, then checked my security camera. I had installed a cheap wireless camera above my front door after the second violation, just in case. The footage showed Betty and the two vest guys arriving at 11:30 a.m. They walked up to the door. Betty knocked twice, waited about 15 seconds, then waved the guys around to the side. The camera angle did not cover the side yard, but I could see them come back around 3 minutes later. Betty was holding her phone, filming the front of my unit, and one of the vest guys was writing something on a clipboard. Then they left. I called the HOA hotline. Betty picked up. I asked her why she was on my property without notice. She said it was a routine safety inspection, authorized under Section 14 of the governing documents, which allows the board to inspect exterior property features for compliance and safety hazards. I told her my door and windows are not exterior features, and she had no right to look through them. She said she did not enter the unit, so there was no violation. I asked who the two people in vests were. She said they were contracted inspectors hired by the HOA to assess winter damage and code compliance across the neighborhood. I asked for their names and company. She said that information is confidential. I told her I have video of the whole thing. She paused, and I heard her flip a page in that notebook. Then she said if I had concerns about the inspection process, I could file a written complaint with the management company, but the inspection findings would be forwarded to me within 72 hours. She hung up. The findings arrived 2 days later, another certified letter. It was a 2-page document with a table listing 8 violations, including gutter ice buildup, front step salt staining, mail slot noncompliance, and something called perimeter snow encroachment, which apparently meant the snowbank along my driveway was too close to the property line. Each violation had a fine attached, ranging from $50 to $125, and the total was $630. At the bottom was a note that said failure to remediate within 10 business days will result in additional penalties and potential legal action. I scanned the whole thing and sent it to Rachel. She called me back within an hour. She said the inspection was legally shaky because they did not give me advance notice, and the violations were vague enough that most of them would not hold up in any real dispute. She also said the contracted inspector's angle was suspicious, because if those two people were not licensed inspectors, the whole report could be invalid. She told me to send a formal response letter demanding proof of their credentials and a detailed breakdown of the alleged violations. I drafted the letter that night and sent it certified mail to both the HOA and the management company. If you are enjoying this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA chaos. While I was waiting for a response, I kept documenting. Every morning I went out and checked the property, took photos, and logged anything new. I also started watching the HOA's vendor activity. Northwind contractors showed up twice in the week after my inspection, once to plow the main parking lot and once to salt the walking paths near the community center. Both times, I saw the same two guys in yellow vests. I took photos of their truck, which had no company logo, just a plain white cab and a plow blade. I got the license plate and ran it through a public records search. The truck was registered to an individual, not a company. That individual's name was Michael Lanning, and when I searched him, I found a single reference in the HOA meeting minutes from 2 years ago. He was listed as a vendor liaison, which meant he had some connection to the board. I sent Rachel all of this. She said it smelled like a shell vendor setup, where someone creates a fake company to bill the HOA for inflated services and then splits the money with a board member. She said if I could prove Betty was connected to Northwind or Michael Lanning, I might have grounds for a fraud complaint. I started going to every HOA meeting, sitting in the back and taking notes. Betty ran them all the same way, reading through violations, approving invoices, and shutting down any questions with a reference to the governing documents or a motion to table. At the January meeting, someone asked why the winter operations budget was over by $10,000. Betty said the excess was due to emergency storm response and contractor rate increases. The other board members nodded. No one pushed back. I raised my hand and asked if the vendor invoices were itemized. Betty looked at me like I had just asked her to explain gravity. She said vendor contracts are handled by the management company and are not subject to member review unless there is a formal audit request. I asked how to request an audit. She said I would need to submit a written petition, signed by at least 15% of the membership, which in this neighborhood meant about 42 signatures. Then, she moved on. That night, I started drafting a petition. Rachel helped me with the language, making sure it was formal and specific. We requested a management audit that exposes the pattern of selective enforcement and suspicious winter vendor charges, with a full review of vendor contracts, invoice records, and board communications related to fines and compliance. I printed 50 copies and started going door to door. Most people would not sign. They either did not care or they were afraid of retaliation. A few people told me Betty had targeted them in the past, and they did not want to make it worse. One woman, an older resident who had lived here since the HOA was founded, told me Betty was running a winter safety committee like a private police force with no authority, and the board let her do it because she brought in fine revenue. She signed the petition and gave me the names of 3 other people who might sign. By the end of the week, I had 28 signatures. I needed 14 more. The next complication hit in early February. The HOA scheduled a special hearing to review my outstanding fines, which by that point totaled over $1,200 across 6 separate violations. The hearing was set for a Thursday evening at 6 p.m., which would have been fine except that the forecast called for a major winter storm starting Thursday afternoon with 8 to 12 inches of snow and ice. I called the management company and asked if the hearing could be rescheduled. They said hearing dates are set by the board and cannot be changed without board approval. I called the hotline. Betty picked up. I explained the storm timing and asked if we could move it to the following week. She said the hearing date was established 30 days in advance, and weather is not grounds for postponement. I told her the roads would be dangerous and possibly impassable by 6 p.m. She said that was my concern, not the board's, and if I did not attend, the fines would be upheld by default and additional penalties would apply. Then she said something that stuck with me. She said, "I do not need proof. I have paperwork and vibes." I asked her to repeat that. She did, word for word, like it was a mantra. "I do not need proof, I have paperwork and vibes." I let her say my name loud, because later I wanted it on the recording. I had started recording all my calls with the HOA after the trespass inspection, using a call recording app that timestamps everything. I thanked her for clarifying and hung up. The storm started at 2 p.m. on Thursday. By 4 p.m., the roads were a mess. I left work early and made it to the community center by 5:45, sliding through 2 intersections on the way. There were only 6 cars in the parking lot. Inside, the meeting room was freezing because the heat was set low to save money. Betty was already at the front table with the same 2 board members. She had that snow-soaked notebook open in front of her, and her phone was propped on a little tripod recording. I sat down in the front row. She did not acknowledge me. At exactly 6 p.m., she called the hearing to order and read my name and address. She said the purpose of the hearing was to review 6 outstanding violations totaling $1,215, and I would have 5 minutes to present any defense or documentation. I stood up and walked to the front. I had a folder with all my photos, the plow schedule, the vendor research, and the call recordings. I started with the curb snow violation. I showed the timestamps proving the plow had covered my curb within an hour of her citation. She said the timing was irrelevant because the rule requires visibility at all times. I showed her the photos of every other curb on my street with the same snow coverage. She said other violations do not excuse mine. I asked if she had cited any of my neighbors for the same issue. She said enforcement decisions are made on a case-by-case basis. I asked what the criteria were. She said that information is internal. I moved on to the guest parking violation. I showed the emails proving I never received a snow emergency alert, and the website screenshots showing the registration requirement buried in a submenu. Betty said the information was publicly available, and lack of registration was my responsibility. I asked why new residents were not automatically registered. She said that was a management company policy. I asked if she had ever recommended changing the policy. She said no. I asked why. She said it was not her role to make policy recommendations. I pointed out that she was the enforcement coordinator, which meant enforcement policy was literally her role. She said the hearing was not a debate and I was wasting time. I looked at the other 2 board members. Neither of them made eye contact. I pulled out the vendor research. I showed the budget discrepancy, the Northwind invoices, and the truck registration records linking Michael Lanning to the HOA. Betty's expression did not change, but I saw her flip a page in that notebook. I asked if she had any financial relationship with Northwind contractors. She said that question was inappropriate and irrelevant to the hearing. I asked if Michael Lanning was a contractor or a board liaison. She said vendor relationships are confidential. I asked if the board had ever verified that Northwind's services matched the invoiced amounts. She said all vendor payments are approved by the management company. I asked if she had ever recommended an audit. She did not answer. I waited. She finally said the hearing was limited to my violations, not HOA financial practices, and if I had concerns about vendors, I could file a separate complaint. I told her I already had, in the form of a petition signed by 28 members requesting a management audit. She looked at me for the first time with something other than contempt. It was closer to anger. She said petition requirements are outlined in the bylaws, and until I reached the signature threshold, the petition had no standing. I told her I would have the remaining signatures within 2 weeks. She said the hearing was over, and the board would issue a decision within 10 business days. I left the community center and drove home through snow that was already 6 inches deep. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. She had been reviewing the call recordings I sent her, and she said the line about paperwork and vibes was gold. She said it showed Betty was making enforcement decisions based on personal bias rather than objective criteria, which would be critical if this ever went to a real legal dispute. She also said the vendor connection was strong enough to justify a formal complaint to the management company, and if they did not respond, we could escalate to the state HOA regulatory board. I told her I wanted to wait until I had the full petition signatures, because once we filed the audit request, Betty would know exactly what I was doing and the retaliation would get worse. The retaliation came anyway. 3 days after the hearing, I got another certified letter. This one was different. It was not a violation notice. It was a formal trespass warning, signed by Betty and the board president, stating that I had engaged in harassment and intimidation of board members during the hearing, and any further contact outside of official HOA channels would be considered trespassing and could result in police involvement. It also said my access to HOA common areas, including the community center and the main walking paths, was suspended pending a behavior review. I read it twice. I had not harassed anyone. I had asked questions, presented evidence, and stayed calm the entire time. Rachel said the letter was retaliation and probably unenforceable, but it was also a sign that Betty was escalating, because she felt threatened. She told me to keep collecting signatures and not to respond to the letter directly. Let them make the next move, she said. We will document everything and use it against them when the time comes. I kept going door to door. I finally hit 42 signatures on a Tuesday afternoon in late February. I scanned every page, compiled the packet, and sent it to the management company with a cover letter requesting a full audit. I copied the board, including Betty, and I sent it certified mail so there would be a record. 2 days later, I got a response from the management company. It was a short email saying they had received the petition and would forward it to the board for review, and the board would determine whether an audit was warranted. That was not the process Rachel and I had researched. According to the bylaws, a petition with the required signatures automatically triggered an audit within 60 days. I forwarded the email to Rachel. She said the management company was stalling, probably at Betty's request, and we needed to escalate immediately. She drafted a formal demand letter citing the bylaw requirement and giving the management company 10 business days to confirm the audit or provide a written explanation for refusal. I signed it and sent it the same day. The next escalation came 48 hours later. I was at work when my neighbor texted me again. Betty was back at my unit with the same 2 guys in yellow vests, and this time they were walking around the back patio with clipboards and a measuring tape. My neighbor said they had been there for over 20 minutes, taking photos and writing notes. I called Rachel and told her what was happening. She said if they were on my property without an emergency and without notice, I could call the police and report it as trespassing. I called the non-emergency line. The dispatcher said they would send an officer, but it might take a while because of call volume. I left work again and drove home. By the time I got there, Betty and the vest guys were gone, but there were fresh boot prints in the snow all around my unit, including right up to my bedroom window. I took photos of everything and waited for the police. The officer showed up about 40 minutes later. I explained the situation, showed him the trespass warning letter I had received, and showed him the photos of the boot prints and the previous inspection footage. He took notes and said the HOA does not have legal authority to restrict my access to common areas, or to enter my property without notice unless there is an immediate safety hazard, and even then they need to document it and notify me afterward. He said the trespass warning letter was not legally binding, and if the HOA tried to enforce it, I could file a harassment complaint. He also said if Betty or her inspectors came back onto my property without notice, I should call 911 immediately and report it as trespassing in progress. He gave me a case number and told me to keep documenting everything. I thanked him and went inside. That night, I got an email from the management company. It was a response to Rachel's demand letter. The email said the board had reviewed the petition and determined that an audit was not warranted at this time, because the concerns raised were based on incomplete information and speculative allegations. It said the board had full confidence in the enforcement procedures and vendor relationships, and any further complaints would need to be submitted through the formal dispute resolution process, which required mediation before any legal action could be taken. I forwarded it to Rachel. She called me immediately. She said the response was garbage, and the board was trying to bury the audit by forcing me into mediation, which could take months. She said we needed to skip mediation and go straight to a public filing with the state regulatory board, because the petition signatures gave us standing and the vendor irregularities were strong enough to justify an investigation. She said she could help me draft the complaint, but I needed to be ready for serious retaliation once it was filed. I told her I was already past that point. The twist came in early March. I was going through the HOA meeting minutes archive on the website, looking for any other references to Northwind or Michael Lanning, when I found something that changed everything. It was buried in a minutes document from 18 months ago, a single paragraph under new business. The board had approved the creation of a winter safety committee with authority to establish emergency protocols and coordinate vendor services for snow removal and ice management. The committee chair was listed as Betty Carter. The committee had no other members. It was just her. And the minutes said the committee would operate with discretionary enforcement authority, which meant she could write violations, hire vendors, and set fines without board approval, as long as it fell under winter safety. The board had given her a blank check. I sent the minutes to Rachel. She said this was huge, because it meant Betty had been operating a one-person enforcement empire with no oversight, and the vendor payments were probably going through her committee budget without any real review. She said if we could prove Betty was profiting from the vendor relationship, either through kickbacks or inflated invoices, it would be fraud and the board would be liable for enabling it. She told me to pull every vendor invoice I could find and cross-reference them with actual services performed. I went back to the HOA website and downloaded 2 years of financial reports. I made a spreadsheet of every Northwind payment, noting the date, amount, and listed service. Then I compared it to the snow records I had been keeping. On at least 4 occasions, Northwind had been paid for emergency plowing on days when there was no measurable snowfall. On 2 other occasions, the invoice amounts were double what other vendors charged for the same service. I sent the spreadsheet to Rachel. She said it was enough to file a formal fraud complaint, but we needed one more thing: proof that Betty had a financial connection to Northwind. That was the trump card I did not have yet. I went back to the public records search and dug deeper into Michael Lanning. I found his address, which was in a nearby suburb, and I found a property record showing he co-owned a rental property with someone named Elizabeth Lanning. I searched her name. No direct hits. Then I searched Betty Carter's full name, Elizabeth Carter, and cross-referenced it with property records. She owned a rental property at the same address. Betty Carter was Elizabeth Lanning. She had remarried or used a different last name, but she was co-owner of a rental property with the same Michael Lanning who ran Northwind Contractors. That was the connection. I printed the property records and sent them to Rachel. She said this was the smoking gun. Betty had a direct financial relationship with the vendor she was hiring through her HOA committee, which was a textbook conflict of interest and probably fraud. She said we needed to get a certified statement from someone who could testify that Betty was aware of the conflict and had hidden it from the board. That was going to be harder. I reached out to the former board member who had posted some of the older meeting minutes, a man named Greg who had resigned 2 years ago. I found his contact info through a neighborhood directory and sent him a polite email asking if he would be willing to talk about his time on the board. He responded the next day and said he would meet me for coffee. We met at a place near the freeway and I explained what I had found. He said he was not surprised. He said Betty had pushed hard for the Winter Safety Committee when she joined the board 3 years ago, and she had sold it as a way to improve response times and reduce costs. But once she had control, she started hiring vendors without competitive bids and writing violations at a pace that made other board members uncomfortable. He said he had raised concerns about vendor oversight, and Betty had shut him down by saying the committee structure was approved by the membership and he did not have authority to question it. He said he resigned because he did not want to be part of what he saw as a shakedown operation. I asked if he would be willing to write a statement describing Betty's pattern and motive. He said yes, but only if it was used in an official complaint, not just a neighbor dispute. I told him I was filing with the state regulatory board, and his statement would be part of the evidence packet. He agreed and sent me a 2-page signed affidavit 3 days later. The final showdown happened in mid-March. I had filed the complaint with the state regulatory board, and the management company had received a copy. 2 days later, I got a call from the board president, the older man who barely spoke at meetings. He said the board wanted to meet with me privately to discuss the complaint and see if there was a way to resolve it without a formal investigation. I told him I would meet, but I wanted Rachel there as my representative. He agreed. We scheduled it for the following Monday at my front porch, because I was not going to the community center and give them home field advantage. Monday came. The board president showed up with Betty and the other board member. Rachel was with me. We stood on my porch in the cold, drifting snow falling around us, and the board president started by saying the board had reviewed my concerns and was willing to consider a settlement. I asked what kind of settlement. He said they would waive all outstanding fines and drop the trespass warning if I withdrew the complaint and the audit petition. I looked at Rachel. She shook her head slightly. I told him no deal. He asked why. I said because the issue was not my fines, it was the systematic abuse and the vendor fraud. Betty stepped forward. She had that phone on the gimbal again, filming everything. She said there was no fraud, the committee was operating within its authority, and my complaint was based on incomplete and misleading information. I pulled out my phone and played the recording from the phone call where she said, "I do not need proof. I have paperwork and vibes." Her face went stiff. Then I pulled out the property records showing her co-ownership with Michael Lanning. I showed it only after she repeated her claim one last time, on record, that there was no financial relationship. She tried to grab the paper. I held it back. Rachel stepped between us and said if Betty touched me or the documents, we would file an assault complaint on top of everything else. The board president looked at the property records. His face went pale. He asked Betty if it was true. She did not answer. He asked again. She said it was a private investment and had nothing to do with the HOA. Rachel said the invoices told a different story, and we had evidence that Northwind had been paid for services that were never performed or were wildly overcharged. She said the state regulatory board would likely refer the case to law enforcement if the investigation found fraud. The board president looked at the other board member. She said nothing. He turned back to me and said the board would need to discuss this internally. I told him the complaint was already filed, and the only way it would be withdrawn was if the board agreed to a full independent audit, a recall vote for Betty's committee position, and a refund of all fines issued under the Winter Safety Program for the past 2 years. He said that was not realistic. I said then we will let the state handle it. Rachel handed him a copy of Greg's certified statement. He read the first page. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket. He told Betty they needed to leave. She did not move. He said her name again, louder. She finally turned and walked back to the street, still filming with that gimbal. The funny karma moment happened 3 days later. There was a sudden gust of wind during another snowfall, and Betty was out on patrol with her printed packet of violation notices. The wind caught the whole stack and sent it airborne, scattering pages all over the street and into the snowbanks. I watched from my window as she scrambled to grab them, slipping on ice and dropping her phone twice. She managed to recover about half the pages, but the rest were gone, buried in the snow or blown into storm drains. My neighbor texted me a video she had taken of the whole thing. It was perfect. Betty's own enforcement paperwork, the thing she had used to terrorize the neighborhood for 3 winters, literally blown away by the same weather she had weaponized. I saved the video. The payback came fast after that. The state regulatory board opened a formal investigation within 2 weeks. The management company received a subpoena for all vendor contracts and financial records. The board called an emergency meeting and announced that the Winter Safety Committee was being dissolved pending the investigation, and Betty was stepping down from all enforcement duties. She did not attend the meeting. The board president read a statement saying the board took the allegations seriously and was cooperating fully with the state. 3 weeks later, the investigation findings were released. The report confirmed that Betty had a financial relationship with Northwind Contractors, that invoices had been submitted for services not performed, and that enforcement had been selectively applied to maximize fine revenue. The report recommended the HOA terminate its relationship with Northwind immediately, refund all fines issued under the Winter Safety Program, and restructure the board to prevent conflicts of interest. The management company canceled the vendor relationship tied to the abuse within 48 hours. The HOA held a special meeting in early April to address the findings. Over 70 members showed up, the biggest turnout in years. The board president opened by apologizing for the oversight failures and announcing that Betty had resigned from the board entirely. He said the board was working with the management company to issue refunds, and a new election would be held in 60 days to fill the vacant seats. Then he opened the floor for questions. The first person to stand up was the woman who had told me about Betty's enforcement history. She said the board should be recalled entirely, not just Betty, because they had enabled the abuse by giving her unchecked authority. Other members agreed. Someone made a motion to hold a recall vote. It was seconded. The board president tried to table it, but the members overruled him. The vote passed. The recall election was scheduled for May. Karen's staged photos, the ones she had taken with that gimbal rig during every patrol and inspection, got used against her. The state investigator had subpoenaed her phone as part of the fraud investigation, and the photos showed a clear pattern of targeting specific addresses, including mine, while ignoring identical violations at other properties. The investigator included several of those photos in the public report as evidence of selective enforcement. Betty tried to claim the photos were for documentation purposes only, but the timestamps and the targeting pattern made it obvious. Her own evidence proved the bias. The recall election was a landslide. All 3 board members, including the president, were voted out. A new slate of candidates, most of them people who had signed my petition, took over in June. One of their first actions was to pass a resolution banning one-person committees and requiring competitive bids for all vendor contracts over $5,000. They also revised the enforcement policy to require photographic evidence of violations, advance notice for inspections, and a formal appeals process with a neutral arbitrator. The Winter Safety Program was restructured as a volunteer-run snow-sharing initiative, where neighbors helped each other with shoveling and ice melt, and the HOA provided supplies instead of citations. The fines were refunded in July. I got a check for $1,215 plus interest. Betty moved out of the neighborhood in August. I heard she sold her rental property and relocated to another state. Northwind Contractors disappeared entirely. Michael Lanning closed the business and stopped bidding on HOA contracts. The new board hired a reputable snow removal company with transparent pricing and a track record, and the winter operations budget dropped back to normal levels. The neighborhood felt different after that. People started talking to each other again, helping with driveways, sharing salt supplies. The fear of random citations and surprise inspections was gone. I stayed. My job stabilized once the HOA chaos stopped, and I even got promoted to a senior coordinator role. Rachel and I stayed in touch, and she helped a few other people in the neighborhood file complaints about old fines and enforcement issues. The new board invited me to join a community outreach committee, and I said yes. We spent the fall organizing a neighborhood cleanup and a winter preparedness workshop, things that actually helped people instead of punishing them. The snow came back in November, and for the first time in a year, I did not dread it. I cleared my walkway, helped my neighbor with her driveway, and watched the plow go by without worrying about a citation an hour later. The curb got buried again, just like always, but this time no one cared. The HOA sent out a reminder email about snow safety, but it was polite and helpful, not a threat. I took a photo of my cleared walkway and sent it to Rachel with a caption that said we did it. She sent back a thumbs up and told me to enjoy the quiet. I did. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.